It has been 21 years since 9/11, and it seems like all of the lessons of 9/11 have been forgotten. And this is not a rarity in human history. Obviously, the distance between, for example, World War I and World War II was about 21 years. It ended in 1918. World War II began in 1939. And so the space of a generation is enough time for people to forget all of the key lessons that they learn from life-changing international events. And 21 years, especially in the modern age, is an extraordinarily long time when it feels like every news cycle is about 5.5 minutes long. But for those of us who are defined by 9/11, for those of us who actually lived through 9/11, for those of us who remember the planes crashing into the towers, it was supposed to be a redefining moment for the United States. It was supposed to refocus us on some important lessons. And that's why it's really important on 9/11 to actually remember the footage of it. Because if you don't remember where you were when 9/11 happened, if you don't remember how stunning it was to watch not one, but two passenger airliners fly directly into the World Trade Centers and collapse the two most populous towers in New York City, then it really did not define you in the same way as it did for other people who watched it happen. What truly is amazing is that a huge percentage of people who actually watched this happen in real time on national television or in person, God forbid in New York City, all those people, a lot of them have forgotten the lessons of 9/11 because as it turns out, politics is not stable. Lessons that you learn have to be relearned over and over again. So I want to go through some of the lessons of 9/11 and then demonstrate how we seem to have forgotten nearly all of them by the year 2022, which is a depressing thought because what it really does suggest is that we are inviting more aggression from our enemies. So it was 8:46 in the morning when the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center. Here's what that sounded and looked like. This is a firefighter, and you can see the plane just flying directly into the tower. I mean, it was legitimately the most stunning thing I think anyone alive had ever seen. And then a few minutes later, obviously, the second plane hits the second World Trade Center tower. I mean, it was just horrific and shocking. It was something out of a horror movie, obviously. The reason I show this is it's important to be reminded of what our enemies did. And of course, you saw the towers collapsing. One of the most frightening scenes in all of American history. It's easy to forget this, which is amazing, considering it was unforgettable. Just and this is not even the most brutal footage, obviously. You see the towers collapsing, nearly 3,000 Americans dead. Just horrific, horrific stuff, obviously. We cut out, we didn't include some of the even more brutal footage of people leaping to their deaths from the 85th story of the World Trade Center. It was unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable was the word to use because I think everybody in the nation was in a state of absolute shock over it. And this was supposed to change how Americans thought about themselves because after all, there was a feeling that had set in after the end of the Cold War that basically all conflict was done, that international conflict was over, that the world was safe, that international diplomacy was going to rule the roost from here on in, that violence against Americans was absolutely unthinkable. And then 9/11 happened, and it really taught us a bunch of lessons that we were supposed to remember. And so I want to talk about 5 of those lessons right now, and we seem to have forgotten nearly all of them. First, the world is smaller than you think. Things that happen far away in lands that we do not know, those things impact the United States economically, in terms of military power, in terms of safety of Americans. These things really affect us. Because after 9/11, after the end of the Cold War, the idea was, okay, well, we can sort of retrench, go back to a certain level of isolationism. We cut our military spending. We started treating terrorism as a law enforcement problem rather than as an international policy problem. We suggested that if the United States sort of withdrew within its own boundaries, that the world will police itself. And that's not the way the world worked. And that is a lesson that we learned on 9/11, is that the world is a very small place. And so when you hear politicians on both sides of the aisle doing, and there's a traditional strain of American foreign policy thinking that says this, right? That basically says if the United States withdraws inside of its borders and doesn't get itself involved in world politics, then we'll be safe. 9/11 was a ringing rebuttal of that because that's pretty much what Bill Clinton had tried to do during the 1990s. So much so that when apparently the American military had Osama bin Laden in its crosshairs, it was essentially called off during the Clinton administration. The second lesson was that weakness, and mostly perceived weakness in any form, economic, military, ideological, invites aggression. If you read the manifesto of Osama bin Laden after 9/11, his manifesto was all talk about how the United States was basically a paper tiger, had made a bunch of promises, had not fulfilled those promises. The United States would run from conflict. After the United States withdrew from Somalia, after the Black Hawk Down incident, after the United States did essentially nothing, after the al-Qaeda bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, after the United States did nothing in the aftermath of the bombing of the USS Cole by al-Qaeda, the impression that was taken away by Osama bin Laden and a lot of other people is that the United States was a paper tiger. And that impression, again, was driven by the fact that we had decided to cut our military spending, that ideologically we were talking a lot about how sort of global liberalism was naturally going to take precedence. It was going to take the fore, that this wasn't an oppositional world anymore, that we had reached the end of history, and the infusion of liberal democratic ideals was going to just be natural throughout the world. And 9/11 rejected all of that. The idea was, if you actually want to protect America, you're going to have to be strong militarily and strong ideologically. You're going to have the wherewithal and the ideological strength to withstand things like long-term commitments. Which brings us to the third point here, which is that culture and institutions can't be imposed except with extraordinary levels of investment and time. And this is a lesson that we mostly learned in the aftermath of 9/11 when we invaded Afghanistan and then Iraq. And there the lesson was, okay, well, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to actually do it. Now, you can go in, you can put a dictator in there. That dictator can clean up some of the mess. Eventually, that dictator will turn against you. You'll have to replace him. And that is one way to do American foreign policy. And traditionally speaking, that is the way that most regimes across the world have done their foreign policy. The British Empire, for example, either directly administered its colonies or it found sort of friendly dictators to administer its colonies. And then when those dictators went rogue, they killed them, they replaced them. And that is not unique to the British Empire. That was true of virtually every empire. It's been true since ancient times. This is how you control it. Go back to the Roman Empire. This is how they controlled their empires. That is one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is the sort of idealistic way, the so-called neocon way of doing foreign policy, which is we're going to go into Afghanistan, we're going to go into Iraq, and naturally democracy will take root and bloom because there is a deep desire for human freedom in the human heart. And not just human freedom, the sort of freedom that the West likes, individualistic, authentic human freedom, sort of atomistic human freedom. The sort of freedom where the things that matter most in your life are how much property you can own or what kind of sex life you can have, things that the West holds very, very dear in terms of individual rights. And for a lot of the world, that's not how they view freedom. Both, I think, unfortunately. But those sorts of institutions don't just magically take root. You actually have to sit there for, in the case of Japan, generations. You have to sit there in the case of South Korea for generations. And you have to be willing to actually expend the money and keep the soldiers over there. And that was the lesson of Afghanistan and Iraq, was that if you seem halfway about this thing, if the idea is you want to transform these countries into footprints for liberal democracy, and you're talking about some of the most backwards regions of the world, you're talking about places with barbaric tribalism as the governing philosophy for entire swaths of these countries. These countries are new creations, by the way. I mean, Afghanistan was never a unified polity. Iraq was not a unified polity for an extraordinary period of time. People tend to forget that the nations of the Middle East, we're not talking about Israel here. The left likes to talk about how Israel was established in 1947, 1948, so it's new. India and Pakistan were not established until 1947, 1948 as separate polities. The separation of India and Pakistan wasn't until 1948. The idea of a Saudi Arabian government didn't exist until the 1920s. So these are, in terms of human history, relatively new polities. In fact, most nations seem to be somewhat new. The nation of Italy, for example, the idea of Italy as a unified country is something that crops up in the 19th century. So I think that we forget sort of historical context for how most people lived for most of time, which was in these tribal, small, autonomous regions. But if you're going to implant the idea of sort of a national government that presides in democratic fashion, that is a long-term thing you have to do. And the West didn't take that seriously. It thought it had taken it seriously, but as Neil Ferguson pointed out in his book American Colossus about the idea of American empire, he said that he was in favor of the war in Iraq, but he said he didn't think the American people would have the stomach to actually do the thing. So that was the third lesson. The fourth lesson was that you have a lot in common with your fellow Americans, more than you think you do, and a lot more than you do with your enemies. And this is something that the American people, as we will see in a second, seem to have forgotten. Right? We tend to talk a lot in the United States about the gaps between Florida and New York, between Texas and California. And those gaps absolutely exist. These are serious ideological gaps. And those gaps seem to be getting wider in the United States. Whatever those gaps are not nearly as wide as the gap between, say, Texas and Afghanistan or California and Afghanistan. And 9/11 was a reminder that the enemies of the American people do not think like Americans, that whatever disagreements we have with each other in the West, and they are very serious and they have real consequences, the gaps between the disagreements in the West and disagreements between people in the West and places like Afghanistan or Iraq or Iran, these are disagreements in kind. Okay, these are not disagreements of degree. I mean, these are differences in kind. Over time, it may be that the disagreements in the West come to resemble the sort of tribalistic differences that we see elsewhere. But at least on 9/11, people in Texas didn't look at what was happening in New York and think to themselves, that's a foreign country, I don't really care. They thought to themselves, that's my fellow Americans who are dying in those towers. We're in a battle for the culture and for our values. Like and subscribe to help keep our videos on the front line of the fight and top of your feed.